Let's start row 6. The top half of the row looks in the diagram from right to left. The first stitch is not woven. The second stitch begins with 2 orange colors. Change to bright red. Align up and down to change colors and knit to both. Change to black. Black move to squares to the right. Need to connect yarn. The next row of black moves to squares to the right and cannot be braided with a single yarn. Reserve only the number of balls used in this row. 5 squares, 12 balls are needed. Connect the black yarn to the bright red yarn. Weave 5 black balls. Change to bright red. Bright red has moved with squares to the right and needs to connect yarn. The next row of bright red moves 3 squares to the right and cannot be braided with a single yarn. Only the number of balls in this row is reserved. 7 squares. You need 16 balls. Connect the bright red yarn to the black yarn. Weave 7 bright red balls. Change to orange. Orange has moved 2 squares to the right. We need to connect yarn. Row 7 move 1 space to the right and weave 2 balls without cutting the yarn. Row 8 move 1 space to the right and weave 2 balls without cutting the yarn. Row 9 move 2 squares to the right and cut the yarn. So R6, R7, R8 can be braided with a single piece of yarn. This small orange block has 7 cells and needs 16 balls. Determine whether a block of color can be woven with a single piece of yarn. It mainly depends on the direction of color movement and how many cells it has moved. Align up and down and move 1 space to the right. You can use a piece of yarn to knit. Can be combined to calculate the number of bulbs. Moving multiple squares to the right and to the left requires cutting the yarn. Do not use a single yarn for knitting. You only need to reserve the number of balls used by the row. With 3 orange balls, change to bright red. There's only 1 cell in this row. The next row moves 2 spaces to the right and cannot use the same yarn. Reserve only for balls of yarn. Connect the bright red yarn to the orange yarn. Weave a ball. Switch to black. Switch up and down. Black, knit a ball. Switch to milky white. Switch up and down. Weave milky white 6 balls. Change to black. Black move 1 space to the left. Need to connect yarn. There's only 1 cell in this row. The next line is aligned with the color switch, or grid. Row 8 moves to the left and cannot use a single piece of yarn, so we only need to reserve the yarn section for a 6 and a 7. To squares, you need 6 balls. Connect the black yarn to the milky white yarn. Weave a black ball. Change to bright red. Bright red, move one space to the left. Need to connect yarn. Weave the squares in this bright red row on my knitting. Next row, align the color change. Weave 2 spaces. Row 8 moves to the left and cannot be braided with a single piece of yarn. Therefore, it is necessary to reserve the yarn segment for row 6 and row 7. For squares, you need 10 balls. Connect the bright red with the black. Weave 2 bright red balls. Turn up and fold the loop needle in half. The bottom half of the row looks in the diagram from left to right. Finish the bottom row by matching the color of the top row. The top half of row 7 looks at the diagram from right to left. The first stitch is not woven. Weave 2 oranges from the second stitch. Black yarn change. Black, move 2 squares to the right. Need to connect yarn. There are 4 cells in this row. Next row of alignment, switch color. 2 squares can be woven with a single yarn. There are 6 squares and you need 14 balls. Connect the black yarn to the orange yarn. Weave 4 black balls. Change the bright red yarn. Bright red, move 3 squares to the right. Need to connect yarn. There are 9 cells in this row. The next row moves 2 spaces to the right and cannot be braided with a single yarn. 9 squares. You need 20 balls. Connect the bright red yarn to the black yarn. Weave 9 bright red balls. Orange yarn. Orange, moves 1 space to the right. Take the orange yarn and the bright red yarn and knit it with the orange yarn. Weave 2 orange balls. Change the bright red. This row has 3 squares of bright red. Row 8 moves 1 space to the right, and there are 5. Row 9 moves 1 space to the right, and there are 7. Row 7, 8, and 9 can all be braided with a single piece of yarn. There are 15 squares, and you need 32 balls. Connect the bright red yarn to the orange yarn. Weave 3 bright red balls. Instead of black, switch colors up and down and knit a black ball directly. Switch to milky white, up and down, straight knit 6 balls. Switch to black, switch colors up and down, and knit 1 ball. Switch to bright red, up and down color switch, knit 2 balls. Turn up and fold the loop needle in half. The bottom half of the row looks at the diagram from left to right. Finish the bottom row by matching the color of the top row. The top half of row 8 looks at the diagram from right to left. The first stitch is not woven. Weave 2 orange balls from the second stitch. Instead of black yarn, switch colors up and down and knit the black balls directly. Bright red has moved 2 squares to the right and needs to rewire the yarn. The next row, bright red, moves 2 spaces to the right. Do not use a single yarn for knitting. Only the yarns used in the row are reserved. 10 squares. You need 22 balls. Connect the bright red yarn to the black yarn. Weave 10 bright red balls. Change orange yarn. Orange moves 1 space to the right. Wrap orange yarn around bright red yarn. Weave 2 orange balls. The bright red yarn moves 1 space to the right. Wrap with bright red yarn and orange yarn. Bright red, knit 5 balls. Change the black. Black move 1 space to the left, need to break yarn. There's only 1 black in the row. Count 4 balls. Connect the black yarn to the bright red yarn. Weave a black ball. Milky white move 1 space to the left, need to connect yarn. Next row milky white move 1 space to the left. Do not use a single yarn for knitting. Only the 14 balls used in the 6 squares of the row are reserved. Connect the milky white yarn to the black yarn. With 6 milky white balls. Black yarn change. Black move 1 space to the left, need to connect yarn. Align row 9 with color change and move a space. Align row 10 with the color change. Row 11 moves 1 space to the right. Align row 12 with the color change. Each of these rows can be braided with a single piece of yarn, and the ball count can be counted together. Connect the black yarn to the milky white yarn. Weave a black ball. Change to bright red. The bright red has a space on my knitting. The next row is aligned with the color switch, or grid. We can count the balls together. Connect the bright red yarn to the black yarn. Weave a bright red bow. The bottom half of the row looks at the diagram from left to right. Finish it against the color of the top half. The top half of row 9 looks at the diagram from right to left. The second stitch begins to knit 2 orange balls. Change to bright red. Bright red has moved 2 squares to the right and needs to cut the yarn. There are 10 squares in this row. From row 9 all the way through row 33, the bright red is an alignment change. A single piece of yarn can be used to knit. This large block of color can be braided with a new ball of yarn. Connect the bright red yarn to the orange yarn. Weave 10 red balls. Orange yarn. Orange has moved 2 squares to the right. We need to connect yarn. This row has 3 squares in orange. Next row, move 2 spaces to the right. Do not use a single yarn for knitting. Reserve only the 8 balls used in this row. Connect the orange yarn to the bright red yarn. Weave 3 orange balls. And then bright red. Bright red moves 1 space to the right. Just wrap the orange yarn in a bright red. Seven bright red balls. Black yarn change. Black moves 1 space to the left and needs to rewire the yarn. Align the next row with the color switch. In the next row, move to the left, not using the same yarn. Rows 9 and 10 have a total of 2 squares and require 6 balls. Connect the black yarn to the bright red yarn. Weave a ball with black yarn. Change the milky white yarn. Milky white moved 1 space to the left. We need join the yarn. There are 5 cells in this row. Next row, align with color, 5 grids. Move the next row to the left, indicate weave with 1 yarn. Rows 9 and 10 have a total of 10 squares and require 22 balls. Make a connection between milky white and black, with 5 milky white balls. Change the black yarn, change the color up and down, and knit 1 ball. Change the bright red yarn, change the color up and down, and knit 1 ball. The bottom half of the row looks at the diagram from left to right. Finish the bottom half against the top half. The top half of row 10 looks at the diagram from right to left. The first stitch is not woven. Weave 2 orange balls from the second stitch. Align again to change colors. Change the bright red yarn. Knit 8 balls. Change to orange. The orange block moves one space to the right or switches colors all the way up to the row 18. A single piece of yarn can be used to knit. There are 17 squares and 36 balls are needed. Connect the orange yarn to the bright red yarn. Weave 3 orange balls. Change to a bright red yarn. Bright red move to squares to the right. Need to connect yarn. Black yarn change. The next row, bright red, continues to move to spaces to the right. Do not use a single yarn for knitting. Reserve only the number of balls in the 9 squares of the row. Connect the bright red yarn to the orange yarn. Weave 9 bright red balls. Change the black yarn, change the color up and down, knit 1 grid. Change the milky white yarn, up and down the color change, knit 5 balls. Change the black yarn, switch colors up and down, weave 2 balls. The bottom half of the row looks at the diagram from left to right. Finish the bottom row by matching the color of the top row. Take a look at this knitting. That's 31 stitches, 30 balls, 10 rows. You can compare it to the diagram. The 5 cases mentioned above are all explained in detail. These methods can be used in the knitting process of the Pixel blanket. Merry Christmas Pixel blanket color is more. The method of reserving yarn segments according to color blocks can be flexibly applied. This black stroke, for example, can be divided into these blocks. Rows 12 through 16 are moved 1 space to the right and can be braided with a single piece of yarn. Row 17 moves the spaces to the right, reserving only the yarn segments used in this row. Row 18 black is divided into 2 sections. The first part is moving 1 space to the right. Rows 18 to 24 can be woven with a single piece of yarn. The later sections run from rows 18 to 23 and can be braided using a single piece of yarn. Row 24 through 26 are a block of color woven with a single piece of yarn. When we get to row 113, it's just orange. You need to cut all the other colors of yarn. Let me show you row 114 again. The top half of row 114 looks at the diagram from right to left. The first stitch is not woven. The second stitch begins to make the knit. Do all the stitches in this row. The bottom half of the row looks at the diagram from left to right. The first stitch is not woven. Start with the second stitch. Finish this row. After row 114, the whole blanket is finished. Start to bind off. Leave the yarn tip on the left. Pull the knitting to the right. This is the first coil. This is the first ball. Take the first coil off the needle and stretch it as wide as you can. Put this ball in this coil. That's a good stitch to put away. This is the second coil, which corresponds to this ball. Be careful not to pull the ball vigorously, which will make the fluff fall off. Put all these coils in their respective balls. This is the penultimate coil. This is the last ball. Loop the penultimate coil over the last ball. This is the last coil. Leave a ball and cut the yarn. Put the ball over the coil and pull it tight. Finish the bind off. This is the back of the knitting, and you can see that there are a lot of these yarn ends. These yarns left over from the color change. Now weave an end. This orange yarn, pull out this used connection yarn. Cut the ball. Use this connecting yarn to tie a knot on the side. Bake it with a lighter. That hides it. Let me show you again. This bright red yarn, pull it out. This is the connection yarn that has been woven. Cut the ball. Tie a knot on the side. Just like this. All the rest of the yarn ends hidden in the blanket in this way. In the process of weaving, we will encounter the situation of insufficient yarn, and we need to connect yarn. Use 2 longer pieces of connecting yarn to tie the knot. And just like that, you can keep weaving. These methods are covered in this video. All the problems we had weaving Snowball Merry Christmas Pixel blankets. You can follow this instructional video to complete the Merry Christmas Pixel blanket. Snowball Merry Christmas Pixel blanket explanation finished.